Hi and welcome to this short tutorial on hand-sewn pin tucks, where I show you some of the different ways I use them in my work. Pin tucks are such a fun and versatile way to manipulate fabric. They're often stitched on a sewing machine, but I love taking the slower approach, hand stitching them in different ways to create beautiful raised texture. It's a beautiful technique that can add depth, detail and a unique character to any textile piece. Here I'm adding pin tucks to the background of a quilted wall hanging. I'm using a beige pearl cotton number 8, which blends with a natural linen background. You can see me pinch a fold in the fabric with my fingers and then secure it with whip stitches, creating a raised texture similar to couching. In the next piece, I'm using the same technique but with a contrasting black thread on a white linen sheet. I've knotted my thread and then I'm coming up through the back of the fabric into the centre of the fold. I lightly crease the line that I want to stitch along with my fingers and thumb before whip stitching. I'm sewing from the right to the left because I'm right-handed. The rows are evenly spaced and you can see how repeating this method builds a beautiful textured pattern. You can place the whip stitches closer together to create a thick, solid line, or further apart as I've done here, so that each stitch is visible. It creates a very satisfying texture to run your hands over and looks great from the front and the back. Here I'm using a beige pearl cotton number 8 again, but this time on rust coloured linen. Instead of working in straight rows, I fold the fabric more freely so the lines form a gentle wave rather than following the grain. Notice that I'm placing the needle through the fold at a diagonal angle so that the stitch travels through the fold and then the appearance of the stitch on the fold is straight. If you wanted the stitches to look diagonal on the fold, then you can pass the needle from back to front perpendicular to the fold. Towards the end of this line, I split it into a V-shaped fold and continue stitching down one side before coming back to stitch the other. Building up the pin tuck in this way starts to suggest a branch-like form. I encourage you to experiment with different types of line, straight, curved, angular, and see which ones suit your project the best. I keep working in this way, folding and stitching, working intuitively with the fabric as it suggests where it needs more stitches and folds. As I add more, you can see how the branch-like form becomes more apparent. I'm also not too bothered here about the size of my stitching or the spaces in between them. The unevenness suits the organic nature of this project. The next variation gives a closer look to machine stitched pin tucks. I'm using a simple running stitch in a fine contrasting thread. I begin in the same way as before by pre-folding where I intend to stitch, except this time I'm taking the fold much deeper, and instead of whip stitching I'm using a simple running stitch parallel to the fold. Gathering up as many stitches as I can before pulling the thread all the way through. I've chosen to have the knot showing on the top of the fabric, but you can always put the knot at the back. I like to straighten out the fabric before continuing to sew so that it doesn't look too gathered, but you could always make a feature of the gathers. When I get to the end of the row, I tie a quilter's knot, which is similar to creating a French knot. I wrap the thread around the needle 2 or 3 times, pinch it and then pull it through carefully, securing the pleat. You can experiment with the height of the folds and the spacing to see how the texture changes. Pin tucks stitched very close to the fold have a neat, subtle look, while deeper folds can become quite three-dimensional and catch the light in interesting ways. I'm judging the spacing by the eye here, but for a more precise result, you could mark guidelines with a removable pen or a Hera marker. In this final sample, I'm creating small raised circles using whip stitch and a fine thread. I find it easier to draw the circles first with a water-soluble pen as a guide for my folds and stitches. As before, I'm gently creasing the fabric, this time curving along my pen lines, before stitching with my fine thread. This time the stitches are much closer to the fold and I've stitched them closer together. Because the thread matches the background, there's not much stitch definition here. It disappears into the fabric, just leaving small raised circles. Again, you can experiment with different weights of threads, such as pearl cotton number 8 or even sashiko thread, and try contrasting colours. This technique also works well with a running stitch for a slightly softer effect. If you've never tried these techniques before, then I recommend experimenting by creating several different samples on a small scale using the same type of fabric. That way you can see which type of thread you prefer or how deep or far apart you like to make each of the pleats. So those are a few of my favourite ways to use this versatile technique. Which one's your favourite? Let me know in the comments if you give it a try. I'd love to know how many different ways you can use pin tucks in your textile projects.